Well, good morning. I hope your Sunday is off to a pleasant start. You know, we often think of the law as something that prevents us from breaking society's rules. But in fact, the law is also there to protect us. In Michigan, the prosecuting attorney is charged with enforcing the law in each county. We'll talk about that responsibility this morning with a prosecutor. It starts right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Here's your host, Don Ryan.
Well, Matt Wiese was appointed to fill the vacancy in 2011 when Marquette County Prosecuting Attorney Gary Walker retired. He was re-elected to that position in 2012 and 2016. His experience in the prosecutor's office goes back much further than that, as he had served as the chief assistant prosecutor since 2002. We'll talk about that service and some new recognition he received recently as we talk with Matt Wiese this morning. Matt, welcome back to the Ryan Report.
Thanks, Don. Good to see you.
Good to have you with us. First of all, that recognition I mentioned, you were recently elected the president-elect of the Michigan Association of Prosecuting Attorneys.
Right.
And as I understand, that's a two-year commitment.
Correct. I've been an officer of the Prosecuting Attorneys Association since 2012, and then I was elected an officer 2 years ago. And they typically transition from Secretary-Treasurer to Vice President to President-elect and then to President. And I was elected President-elect, which means in 2020 I would become the next president of the association.
Tell us more about the association.
Right.
What does it do and what's its mission?
The Prosecuting Attorneys Association represents all 83 elected county prosecutors in the state of Michigan. They do a myriad of things. They have tech support. They provide our adult case tracking system that most prosecutors use around the state, so we can track numbers on criminal cases all over the state. They provide a lot of education and training for both elected and assistant prosecutors. They also have a voice for us in Lansing. We have a public affairs person who works with the legislature on hot topics and criminal issues. We have a prosecution integrity unit, we have violence against women unit, we have a highway traffic safety unit. So there's a lot of resources there that the association provides for all the prosecutors around the state.
I know you're a busy guy, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it sounds like you're going to be even busier when you get to be the president.
Yeah, I will be busy. It's a commitment I made in 2016 that I knew I would have to make some trips to Lansing, and I usually try to drive down after work, take care of business the next day, then drive back that night.
In Michigan, we've gone the last several years through this movement. Well, the concern has been the high price of corrections in Michigan.
Right.
The legislature has been actively involved in that
Right.
process. They've suggested some or looked at some possible changes. Does your association get involved with them in providing the opinion of those in the law enforcement side?
Absolutely. We put out a corrections report a number of years ago, and we just updated it. And we keep track of what types of offenders are in prison. We also look to make sure that what we do in the criminal justice system and its impact on corrections is made aware. What we do know, Don, is that approximately 70% of the prisoners incarcerated in Michigan prisons are there for violent offenses, as opposed in the federal system, it's more drug and white-collar crimes.
Okay.
So we try to be pretty aware and cognizant of not filling the prisons with people that are not violent. We want to save that space for making our streets and our communities safer.
I know when we talked the last time, which was a few years ago, one of the issues being debated in Lansing was called presumptive parole.
Right.
Liberalizing the parole
Right.
rules. Whatever happened with that?
That did not go through.
Okay.
We still have what's called truth in sentencing. So whatever the minimum sentence that a judge sets, that person still has to serve in Michigan, which is good for the integrity of the system, and it's good for victims of crime, so they know this is what their offender gets. So there's still no good time or special good time. A couple of exceptions of that are we have what's called special alternative incarceration, which people know as boot camp. If people go to boot camp in the prison system, then they could get out a little earlier. But those are usually like a younger person that makes a dumb mistake, maybe does some burglaries, to get them kind of turned on the right path.
I know one of the issues that was discussed, I believe, is maybe still under consideration, is the 17-year-old as a minor
Right.
in Michigan.
Right.
Is that a good decision?
Well, we're looking at that. There's a thing called Raise the Age, and we're one of just a handful of states now in the country that still do not recognize 18 as the age of majority. And that is being looked at, and I do expect that it'll change in Michigan in the not too distant future.
I think it may be passed in the Senate, but
Right.
It's maybe still not passed through the House.
It's working its way through. And we're not in concept opposed to that at all, but local counties have to bear the costs. So if somebody who was 17 now goes through the probate court system, there's additional costs there because they're not going through the adult system, they're going as a juvenile. So the funding is always the trick. What does the state pay and what do the locals have to pick up?
I know one of the other issues being discussed too is movement to expunge ex-offenders,
Right.
previous offenders.
Right. There's a whole movement afoot right now nationally. It's called generally criminal justice reform. And one of the things is we look at pretrial incarceration, who should be in jail, who shouldn't. We also look at redemption for people that have had criminal records. And currently, the law says you could have 3 convictions and still get your record expunged after a period of time. They're looking to liberalize that to maybe look at if the person's been crime-free for 10 years in a row, could they then get their record cleaned up? And in concept, prosecutors and our association are not opposed to those types of ideas because we think that people should have a second chance if they can prove that they can be a contributing member of society.
I guess the only question that came to my mind is, could you wind up with someone in a sensitive job if the person hiring wasn't aware of the fact that the person had been a felon at one time?
Well, certain offenses will never be allowed to be expunged, like a crime against a child, a sexual assault against a child, a murder, attempted murder, crimes of sexual delinquency. So those wouldn't be allowed to be expunged.
Okay.
But certain other crimes could. So yeah, if somebody did embezzle and then 10 years later they got their record expunged, then that employer may not know that they had that. But the hope is that that 10 years of crime-free living shows that they have a pattern set up so that they're not going to reoffend.
Okay. We'll bring it closer to home in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this break. Our guest this morning is Marquette County Prosecuting Attorney Matt Wiese. You know, I believe that your office is probably the largest one in the whole northern half of the state of Michigan, isn't it?
North of Traverse City, we may be about the same size as Traverse City, but other than Traverse City, you have to go all the way down to the Bay City, Saginaw area.
Okay. I read a quote which I thought was interesting. It says, "The responsibility of a public prosecutor differs from that of the usual advocate. His duty is to seek justice, not merely to convict."
Right.
Is that something you agree with?
I absolutely agree with that. That's a quote from Justice Sutherland in a case from, I think, the 1920s or 30s, that we're in a unique position that our job is to seek justice, not a conviction. Our job is to make sure that justice is done. And so we're the gatekeepers. You know, a lot of the stuff that the police bring us don't ever get into the system. Approximately 15 to 25% of the cases that we get, we decline or we don't put into the system for whatever reason.
I was going to ask you about that because you really work together, don't you,
Right.
in many cases, and you have a strong working relationship, I'm sure. But there are also times you must disagree too, as well, right?
There are, and it's a tough conversation to have with a fellow law enforcement official to tell them they got it wrong, or they didn't follow the constitutional rights that are in place for everybody. It's rare, but we have to make that call. Because we're a check and a balance, just like the judge is a check and a balance on what we do in our authority. And
I'm sure you have to feel somewhat confident that you have the evidence you need to go forward before you bring someone to court.
Absolutely, absolutely. People can be arrested and charged on a pretty low criminal standard called probable cause, but as you know, to be convicted, they have to be proven guilty by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's always a delicate balance as to what can you prove beyond a reasonable doubt versus, you know, what is enough to just charge somebody. So we're pretty, I think, responsible in exercising our discretion that we don't charge people unless we're confident we can prove the case if we have to.
And double jeopardy is kind of lurking in the background too, I suppose. Huh?
Absolutely, because you only get one shot at it. If we make a mistake or if we get it wrong, we can't do it again.
Are there other decisions that go into that process besides not feeling you have the right evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. Victim input is a huge component. Sometimes, you know, if it's a family member that committed a crime or stole from a family member, they may want to take an alternative form of justice. You know, maybe there's treatment that should be afforded to the person. So, you know, they might take that option. Or if we do charge them, and if it's related to maybe an addiction, we give them an opportunity to not get a permanent record by going through a drug court or through a sobriety court. So those factors come into play, and sometimes just people do things that are just dumb, although they may be criminal, and people, you know, everyone can recognize that this isn't something that needs to be put in the criminal justice system. The person's addressing the mistake they made.
Right. You know, I think a lot of people look at the prosecutor's office and see it mainly as, well, they'll see a case in court now and then,
Yeah.
and they'll see the prosecutor there. But it was kind of amazing to me. You actually deal with thousands of cases a year, don't you? Not necessarily court cases, but cases you have to deal with.
Yeah, we have 3,000 or more cases every year that we look at, 2,500 to 3,000 that are charged, and obviously you could never try every case. So we're busy. It's kind of a triage mentality. We deal with the crisis that happened last night, this morning, and then we get that into the system, and then tomorrow we deal with whatever happens tonight. And we have to be able to address whatever happened last night, you know, every morning. 365 days a year we're on call. We go in, we meet with the police. It's a busy operation.
And many of those cases, or a large percentage, not half, but are felonies too, aren't they?
Right. We've had a steady increase of felony cases over the last 6 years, from around 300 to 400 a year to well over 600 now. And those cases take a lot more time. And if they're a victim of violence crimes, such as a sexual assault or physical violence, those take a lot more time. As you could imagine, if you were badly beaten up by somebody, you'd want to be able to sit down and talk to the prosecutor about the case, what to expect, what can possibly happen here by going forward, versus if somebody, you know, stole a bike or stole a car, that person may not have the same type of level of intensity or interest in the case. So it takes a lot of time.
I know we were trying to schedule this interview, that you can get very busy and sometimes hard to find time.
Right. Like just this morning, I thought we could do this earlier, and we had a pretty serious felony case that came on our docket within the last couple of weeks, and those take priority, and that got scheduled earlier, so we had to bump that a little bit.
Has the reduction of the number of circuit court judges in Marquette County made this more difficult?
It has made it more difficult. And I wrote a letter recently that I actually brought here today that I submitted to the State Court Administrator's Office that talks about our case load increase and how we have cases scheduled. I mean, currently, like today, we originally had 6 or 7 felony jury trials scheduled. And it wasn't until yesterday that we could say, yes, we can cancel these other cases because this one's going for sure. So if the top one settles, we go to the second one. If that one settles, we go to the third one. So we're prepping multiple cases to go to trial, not knowing which one may end up going.
And it's probably not likely that the number of judges will change, or maybe you're hoping it will?
We're hoping it will. If you look at what we have in Marquette County with our cases and the number of judges we have and compare that to other circuits around the UP in northern lower Michigan, we have more cases with less judges. Okay. And I certainly am not suggesting that we take away from anyone else, because that's not what we're saying, but the workload is pretty heavy. And having that judge not there, we're feeling it now, especially with approximately 100% increase in the felony cases over the last 5 to 6 years.
More questions for you in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on today's show after we take one more break. Talking with Matt Wiese, Marquette County Prosecuting Attorney. You know, we were talking about the crimes in Marquette County. What is the main criminal problem? The
main criminal problem that we're dealing with right now, Don, is methamphetamine. Okay. Methamphetamine has been a scourge in our community. It's a highly addictive drug. We were carrying numbers that over the last number of years that, you know, we went from 28 methamphetamine cases in 2013 to 157 last year. Wow. Those are all 10 and 20-year felonies. And we're projected to probably go over 200 this year. And it's gone from that homegrown, where they make it, you know, at home in a bottle, to now it's the cartel meth that's coming in from Mexico. So it's cheaper, it's more plentiful, and it's profitable if people want to deal it. And it's caused a lot of harm in our community, and we're fighting the fight, but it's such an addictive substance. It's very hard to get people clean and sober once they get on methamphetamine.
And beyond meth, I'm sure there are other drug issues as well. Many cases.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing heroin coming in. We're seeing a lot of prescription drug abuse. That's something that the state has been cracking down on by trying to create new systems where doctors have to check before they can write a script. There's limitations on if they're writing narcotics. They can only write a prescription for a certain amount of time before it has to be renewed. So that has also been a problem.
I know one of the issues that is one of your personal interest and in your office is domestic violence.
Right.
And you did receive a grant, and you have a special program going on in Marquette County. Tell us about that.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, we received a federal grant from the Department of Justice for our domestic violence project, which is called the Domestic Violence Blueprint for Safety Project. And it's now in its 4th year, and it's fully implemented with all the law enforcement agencies in the county. We have a satellite location at K.I. Sawyer, where we have a place for police and for victims both to go if they need assistance. It's staffed full-time with an advocate from the Women's Center, and the funding from our grant pays for that and pays for partial funding for the advocate too. So it's a good project because it focuses on holding offenders accountable and trying to increase the safety that victims have, and that it's to give them a sense that the system will respond with positive messages of support, and it seems to be working, and I think that we're getting better cases. Law enforcement, I think, is doing a better investigation, and we're getting better results in trying to reduce domestic violence.
And I know, based on the conversation we had, that you want to take this opportunity you have coming up to even expand this program beyond Marquette County, of course.
Right. And in April at the Prosecutors Board meeting, I pitched the Blueprint for Safety to the Prosecutors Board, and they approved the concept of going forward around the state to see if we could maybe replicate this around the state. So I've had numerous meetings with state agencies, law enforcement officials, to talk about how that model might work and be replicated around the state. And that's a work in progress, but we're looking at maybe some pilot projects next year that we could offer around the state, and maybe a domestic violence summit in October of 2020 that we would invite communities to attend and look at the model and see if they might want to try it in their community.
What, we should tell people, what should they do if they feel they're being affected by domestic violence?
If someone's unsafe, they should make a safety plan. If they're being threatened or harmed, they should call the police. But to make a safety plan and read up on domestic violence, because it's one of those things where I believe someone can get conditioned, because it doesn't just happen overnight. Right. You know, it happens gradually, and people come to accept it, and they need to know that they shouldn't have to accept being victimized in a domestic violence relationship. So call the police, have a safety plan. If it doesn't get too violent or too bad, there are programs that can help. Help the person that commits the violence to learn, why do they do this, and how did they get to this point, and try to unlearn that behavior.
It's certainly good for people to know that there is help out there for them.
Yes, there is.
And we don't have much time, but I noticed that you had a dog too.
Yes.
Tell us about that quickly.
We have a canine advocate in the office. He's been with us for about 4 years now. His name is Harv. He was trained to be a seeing eye dog for the blind, but he washed out because he had bad hips. Okay. And so he's very well trained. He provides a lot of good emotional support for especially victims of violent crime when they come in the office. Okay.
Thanks for coming in this morning. Appreciate it very much. We'll have some other thoughts for you in just a couple of minutes. Have you ever noticed the phrases people use that put us on notice? They're going to tell us something or do something we aren't going to like, and they think that by using that phrase it will make everything all right. Let me explain what I mean. I was at a meeting the other day and offered my views on an issue we were discussing. I thought I made some very pertinent arguments, at which point one of the other participants in the meeting stood up and said, "Don, with all due respect," and went on to disagree with everything I said. Now, I'm not saying the guy didn't have the right to disagree with me, but really, where was the all due respect? Of course, before the words were out of his mouth, I knew what to expect. No one says, "with all due respect," and then goes on to agree with you, which of course would be very respectful. But it just doesn't happen. The phrase is a warning that something you aren't going to like is about to be said. It has nothing to do with how much they respect you. And they think by stating that phrase, it makes everything okay. Another version of that phrase is the expression, no offense. Again, you make a point at a meeting or in a conversation, and someone pipes up and says, no offense, and then they go on to offend you by disagreeing with everything you just said. I'd like to respond that saying no offense doesn't mean I'm not going to be offended by what they say, but it doesn't really change anything. Sometimes we respond to that no offense comment with the reply, none taken. But deep inside, is that really true? How about the expression, I don't want to brag, but? The key word there is but. What they should really be saying is, you know, what you did was okay, but let me tell you what I did. Because in fact, what the expression, I don't want to brag, really means is, pay close attention to me because I want to brag about something. Have you ever been talking with someone and had a third person walk up and say, I don't mean to interrupt, but? Once again, the key word is but, because in fact, they did mean to interrupt. If they didn't mean to interrupt, they wouldn't have done it. I'm not saying I can't be interrupted. In fact, there's a very good chance their business was important and deserved my attention. I'm just saying, don't say, I don't mean to interrupt, when in fact that's exactly what we intend to do. And finally, there's the expression used by storytellers when their tale has probably already gone on too long. At that point, what you have to say is, to make a long story short. I think I'll try that one. To make a long story short. I'll be back in a minute. Before we ring down the curtain on today's show, let me again remind you that you can get the latest news anytime at uppermichigansource.com. You'll also find a rebroadcast of today's show and past episodes at that same address. Thanks to Matt Wiese for joining us this morning to provide some insights into the work of prosecuting attorneys in Michigan. And thank you for tuning in. Hope you'll plan to be here again next Sunday morning.